Welcome to Alliant International University's podcast on the changing nature of work. This podcast was produced in April 2020 by organizational psychology master's and PhD students mentored by Professor Denise Lopez. The goal of our podcast is to provide listeners with insights about how technology and social trends are transforming work and how leaders can respond constructively to balance employee and business needs. Our third episode is entitled The Gig Economy, featuring Chris Chang, Daniel Faynshel, and Jason Chang. As contractual and independent work increases within today's networked environment, there are several benefits as well as challenges that arise. Chris, Daniel, and Jason will discuss what organizations need to do to operate ethically and responsibly with gig workers.
Thanks, Dr. Lopez. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Chang. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Alliant.
Hi, I'm Daniel Faynshel. I'm also a fourth-year PhD student at Alliant.
And I'm Jason Chang. I'm a second-year master's student at Alliant University. And like our professor told you, we're going to be talking about the gig economy and some aspects of it that are important to the field of IO Psych, like the classification of gig workers, their stability and security, and what IO practitioners can do to impact the situation. We also want to focus on the ethical implications that these aspects have. But before we can really do that, we need to know what exactly a gig worker is. According to the Pew Research Center, 72% of Americans have used a gig service before, but 89% don't fully understand what the term gig economy means.
So let's break down what a freelance or gig worker is. These are people that have either specific skills, do some sort of labor. They're either in the transportation sector like Uber or Lyft, or in the delivery sector like Grubhub. And really, with freelance, you're getting assigned by a platform to be introduced and to negotiate with a potential client. While modern gig work, you have a platform that just automatically assigns people to do the job.
So gig work isn't actually anything that's new. Mary Gray, who's a senior researcher at Microsoft, thinks of gig work as a type of ghost work because it can be handled completely online, it can be controlled based on demand and available resources at any time, and overall, it has more to do with the role of technology in the process of working.
And just to really paint a picture for you guys, almost 95% of jobs created since 2005 are economy jobs, gig economy jobs. That means the amount of people that occupied a full-time position has been relatively the same since 2005, and all those new job openings have been filled by gig economy workers.
And with that kind of growth, it looks like roughly a third of U.S. workers are now employed in at least one gig service. And the distinction is it's not really a specific kind of work, but it's a set of work conditions. And these conditions lower the value of the individual in favor of the platform they're working for. And through this relationship, it turns out organizations are being heavily favored versus their workers in this business. So now Daniel's going to explain what really defines a gig worker from a full-time employee.
So I wanted to get into some of the rights and really the crux of our discussion, the misclassification of employees as gig workers. Right now, there's a legal difference between employees and gig workers / freelance workers can remain as independent contractors if they don't have a set schedule, if they don't get told how to do their job. And these are kind of like some of the qualities. And companies try to get away with classifying employees as gig workers in order to pay less taxes and benefits. And it also avoids labor laws.
So it turns out they're doing all this stuff, but aren't there a lot of types of gig workers out there?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. So there's 3 types of freelance gig workers that I'm seeing right now, and Sherm kind of breaks it down. Your old-fashioned freelance / gig worker is either employed through a staffing agency or professional organization, and they may receive benefits through that sponsoring organization. Then there's certain organizations like Uber that potentially offer health and retirement benefits, but
So it sounds like there's a lot of different conditions for each type of gig worker. What are some of the more general pros and cons for each of them?
Oh, sure, Jason. So some pros are flexible hours, ability to choose the exact work that you want to do, be your own boss, and they're usually paid a little bit more than employees performing the same job, but it's also offset by the lack of benefits.
I see.
Some of the cons are few or no benefits, vacation, sick days, health insurance, retirement. They don't get any of that.
And to pull a quote from a freelance accountant, they said, quote, "There is no such thing as a sick day. I still haven't decided if this is good or not. And since people can't see me, sometimes they won't get back to me." And this really highlights the lack of benefits and the lack of communication regarding this.
Yeah, Chris, that really sheds like a harsh reality of what's going on. To pile on, some more cons are no legal protections from discrimination or harassment, no family paid leave, no unemployment insurance. The list just goes on and on.
Wow. So, those pros seem pretty typical, or like very common from what I hear from a lot of gig work, but those cons seem pretty significant. So what do gig workers really want, like, at their core?
Sure. They want to be treated like employees. They want to have that training and development. They want to have business cards, email addresses, telephone extensions. They want to participate in company events. But the truth is that organizations can't provide full-time benefits to gig workers because then there's no incentive to be a full-time worker. So I wanted to talk about a final piece towards the misclassification of gig workers. Assembly Bill 5 was passed last year, which changed how businesses could treat gig workers and freelancers. This law went into effect this year on January 1st. This bill is controversial because, as the LA Times puts it, it could upend the relationship between workers and bosses across businesses as varied as ride-hailing tech giants, construction, healthcare, trucking, janitorial services, nail salons, adult entertainment, commercial fishing, and newspapers. The relationships that organizations and businesses had with gig workers and freelancers is now terminated. They have to either have them as employees, part-time or full-time, or they have to let go. And unfortunately, this has affected more people negatively than positively.
From what you're telling me, it sounds like organizations have that control in how they choose to classify their workers.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting because that point you brought up earlier about how organizations, they don't want to provide full-time benefits to gig workers. Otherwise, there's no incentive to be a full-time worker. Daniel, I wanted to kind of touch on a point that you had brought up previously, that organizations can't provide full-time benefits to gig workers because then there's no incentive to be a full-time worker.
Yeah.
And that really encapsulates my topic of research for this, really the financial stability and employment security of gig workers. And what I found was that really a lot of employment practices in gig work risk compromising employee financial security in the long run. And by not providing equivalent levels of security for gig workers compared to a traditional employment career, organizations are, secondhandly kind of pushing employees into situations where financially taking care of themselves is really difficult. And Daniel, you had actually shown us that picture. There was someone that was delivering for Uber Eats, but they were in a wheelchair and, they had their face mask on to not get sick. And despite
That's so rough.
Facing a very significant disability, they still have to make ends meet. And, in some ways, I guess you could see gig work as an opportunity for people to do that. But I think for us as IO psychologists, the fact that people are able, or are allowed to work in those kinds of conditions, it's not standardized and it's really not like to their benefit. And you had talked about, the different kinds of gig workers and like the difficulties that they face. And I feel like a lot of those issues are like intensified even more with the pandemic that's going on. Because recently, a lot of independent contractors and freelancers are falling out of contact with their clients. A lot of them are having their contracts closed. And, if they're not already in work, they're having a lot of difficulty contracting work in the first place. I don't think, I imagine a lot of people aren't, getting into any work at all.
It's a lot of chaos out there.
Yeah. And, the organizations are wrapped up in their own ends that they end up falling out of contact with all these individuals. But regardless of that, the contracted workers still need to make ends meet, and they're pushed into working despite unsafe conditions and risk of contact with others. One person had commented that they could make a lot more money if they decided to work more, but the benefit of, being a gig worker gives them that flexibility, but they are 100% straight commission. So if they don't fill the positions that they're working in, then they don't get to eat, and it's really not for the lighthearted. So when it comes to something like the financial stability and security of the employee, I think that's really where, our studies as IO psychologists come into play. We really have to make sure that, if we ever consult with an organization that's using gig work, that we have to advise them in a way that's not putting employees in financial risk. With everything that's going on, a lot of companies are really just reacting to the situation rather than having any kind of plan set up beforehand. And it's ending up showing in ways like, again, cutting contact, closing contracts, are mostly like for the short term to make those financial gains, but they don't really play out well in the long term. A lot of companies out there are reacting to the situation that's going on rather than having plans set up beforehand. And this is manifesting in ways like cutting contact with their gig workers. They're closing contracts. There are a lot of companies that are putting employees on furlough so that they can avoid paying those severance fees. And while this might be good for the company financially in the short term, it's really, the individuals that end up having to suffer. They get no pay, they lose their jobs, like all of their professional projects are halted and they lose all their momentum.
Man, it really sounds like gig workers are getting the short end of the stick here. And with all these negatives from companies, is there anything at least that organizations are doing to attract more gig workers?
Yeah, and it seems that way because a lot of employees are getting the short end of the stick. And currently, organizations really aren't doing much, like for the benefit of gig workers. In fact, many organizations are choosing to classify contracted workers in specific ways in order to make those short-term financial gains. Instead, what they should consider doing is reinvesting capital into the company for the benefit of the worker. And doing something like this can, for one, make the company more competitive. It can help improve the ethics and industry practices, and for the company itself, it really strengthens the organization overall. Creating something like this can be very difficult, and it's dependent on a lot of different things. But for a specific example, organizations can create programs that would allow their gig workers to move laterally within the company after proving their capabilities in one position. While it wouldn't be an increase of professional power, something like this can create more internal development for the company while also benefiting the employee. One person had commented that the gig market is quickly becoming saturated, and it's because it's becoming easier to get hired. But when everyone is getting hired, it really dilutes the market and ultimately dilutes the income potential for each individual. So one person might have been able to live off of one gig job back when, gig work was becoming a new thing. But nowadays, people are having to take on several gig jobs. They might deliver for multiple apps like ride sharing, food delivery, and they're just trying to look for as much income as possible just to make the same level of income as a traditional worker.
It's like a race to the bottom. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, just to stay afloat and reach the bare minimum, they're putting in an insane amount of work. But it's really complicated when it comes to what organizations can provide for them, because an organization's ability to provide security for an employee is really dependent on where the organization is at itself professionally and in their industry.
Jason, I think you did a fantastic job talking about the ins and outs of being a gig worker in this economy. And just thinking about this big picture as a whole, where is gig economy going to? Chris, what do you think?
Despite all these negatives, the outlook of the gig economy is growing and it'll still grow. Automation is going to disrupt some gig work. So we all know that in like a decade or two, we're going to have self-driving cars become more of a norm. And with that, it's going to displace a lot of Uber drivers and Lyft drivers because, heck, when I pull up the Uber app and I call up a ride, a self-driving car is just going to come up and there doesn't need to be a driver in that transaction.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we've heard Amazon doing like a drone delivery system. Who needs DoorDash when you can have a drone just fly your food and groceries over to your house?
I don't think I can get used to that.
Yeah. Just imagine going outside and having like a drone just, drop a parcel for you. No interactions needed. It's pretty crazy. So with all these technology changes, companies really need to look out for how they handle these displaced workers in the future. And speaking with the supply and demand, there's that COVID-19 situation that we're all going through right now. It's definitely mismatching our supply and demand for these workers. A lot of Uber drivers are seeing that there's a huge shortage of rides, and where are they going to find work if no one wants to go outside and use their ride service? But there's a positive note in all that where food delivery apps are seeing more of a demand. So, for example, DoorDash workers, they have an increased demand and they're doing all right. But you also have to account for all these other gig workers who are seeing more negatives than positives through this pandemic. And as we see, unemployment's increasing among gig workers, and that's hurting a lot of them because they're not getting unemployment benefits. And with so many Americans living paycheck to paycheck, like even missing 1 week is pretty bad.
Yeah.
And if they're being asked to miss 2 weeks, that's pretty much catastrophic to them.
Yeah.
And it really brings up the point of these workers are kind of seeing that missing 2 weeks for them is pretty deadly. And if you think about it, how is this different from like any other injury or illness that they might go through previously, where they'd have to miss like a week or two to recuperate? That's pretty bad for them during that time too. And it's taken this COVID situation to bring all of this to light. So we really have to look at it in like a big picture.
Right. Yeah. Kind of going back to what I was saying about employment security, it seems like the COVID situation is really bringing to light, for a lot of gig workers that, they're realizing just how fragile their job security is.
Yeah, it's taking all this to bring to light that, their job security is pretty bad, and there are certain rights that they have to address to make sure that they make ends meet. Because, if anything goes wrong, if they get sick or they get injured, then their livelihood just gets cut out because they're missing all these benefits and rights. And these workers are being asked to work in like risky work conditions even today. For example, Uber and Postmates, they still have to do deliveries to fill an increased consumer demand.
That's nuts.
Yeah, they're not even given personal protective equipment. They don't have benefits to account for if they do get infected while working.
You're saying they have to pay out of pocket for their own protective equipment?
Yeah, it's pretty rough. Like Uber can't even, there's no way Uber can logistically give out protective equipment for everyone. So it's up to the drivers themselves to have to supply their own. And there's no standard for it. People might just wear like plastic bags over their head, and call it protective equipment. There's no standard operating procedure, and it's just something that we need to address, especially in terms of like national emergencies and disasters. How will these companies respond to that in terms of their gig workers?
Yeah.
Yeah, so many parent companies, such as Uber and Airbnb, they claim they're neutral marketplaces because they're providing a platform. And to them, if they're claiming to be a neutral marketplace, they're kind of ridding themselves of this responsibility of taking care of their gig workers, and they're leaving their workers on their own. But in doing so, they're kind of hurting their own image because of all the current developments. So we hear all these like negative news about Uber drivers being like unemployed and all that. So it's hurting the image of Uber. And to handle that, they have to find ways to help their entrepreneurs so that their image isn't hurt.
Wow. So, Chris, let me ask you this. Are gig companies doing anything to address this? It seems like they are. It seems like they aren't. What do you have to say?
Yeah, so recently there's been some developments. Uber, for example, they're planning to compensate drivers for up to 14 days if they're diagnosed with COVID-19, or if they're located in an area that's being asked to quarantine or stay in place. And some other companies such as Lyft are also adopting these policies. And it just brings it back to like that reactionary thing that Jason was talking about, how these companies don't have anything set in place. They're just acting as a reaction to everything that's going on. And it
Right.
took like outrage over Uber drivers missing work for Uber to implement this. So, they got to come up with something to prevent this rather than to react to it. Luckily, something that launched pretty recently was Uber launching Work Hub on April 6th, which was pretty recent. And WorkHub is a way for these workless drivers to find jobs on Uber Eats and Uber Freight, which is their trucking and delivery service, which isn't being disrupted, and also through Uber Works, which is a temporary work program for Uber drivers. So it's really good that Uber is doing all of this to account for the pandemic, and they're doing their best to help their gig workers. And we hope to see that a lot of other companies are going to adopt similar policies in the future. And that brings me to the point of how IO psychologists should consult with our clients in the future to promote ethical practices. As we've seen in Jason and Daniel's discussions previously, we as IO psychologists really need to reconsider the definition and values of work and services to accommodate different kinds of jobs. And we really have to ask ourselves, what types of demands are being asked of these gig workers? At some point, these listed demands would make a gig worker a full employee, So we'll have to distinguish what really sets them apart, and if it trickles into the territory of them having all the work responsibilities as a full-time employee, then maybe they should really be getting these rights.
Yeah.
So something else that companies and practitioners have to think about is that having all this external talent poses a challenge for training and development. Let's take Uber, for example. Every driver working for them, it expands like throughout the country and even throughout the entire world. So there's people from different backgrounds and educational backgrounds as well. You're going to have to develop some training and development and SOPs that would adapt to all these types of workers. So that comes as a challenge, trying to make your training and development program work for everyone in your company. Yeah, and that also brings to the point of how will recruiting change? What are we looking for in these workers? Something that some quote I found from a freelance writer was, quote, "You need an incredible amount of determination, and I believe it has to be from one of these people whose natural disposition is to work. You also need the ability to get back up each time you're knocked down." And I think this quote really brings to light that a lot of these workers have to have this grit and determination to persevere even through unstable work conditions. And that's something that companies have to think about when they're looking to allow people to take on their platform in order to look for work. Like, are they allowing their work only to be done by people with like strong determination to push through no matter what, or are they trying to make it more open and engaging for anyone? Where like, if you just want to do casual work, you can definitely do that. So they have to create regulations and processes aimed at these different types of gig workers to account for all these different aspects that workers come from, all these different backgrounds, and what workers want from their platforms. So kind of a takeaway for IO psychologists for this aspect is to think about how companies can look forward in the future and adopt these policies to make sure that these gig workers are getting what they need from their platforms, and to make sure that everyone is satisfied going forward, as we all know that this is definitely going to grow in the future, and companies have to stay ahead of that growth in order to develop policies. So I kind of want to ask Daniel and Jason, what were your takeaways from this podcast and discussion?
Definitely, and using the lens of the IO psychologist, I want people in our field to really look at the job analyses and the competency modeling, and seeing if you're telling people how to do their job, if you're telling people what hours they can work, then maybe you're misclassifying employees as gig workers, and that's something that we should really bring into light. Jason?
Yeah, and as well, looking in that IO psychologist lens, I think we practiced looking at things in different scales, from like the big picture down to the really specific nitty gritty. And when it comes to the topic of the gig economy and gig workers, we really need to help organizations understand the impact they have on the workers on the individual level. And really, that covers all the topics that we wanted to talk about the gig economy. Just to really reiterate and drive home, we want to restate that the current trends really favor the organizations too heavily, at the loss of the individual. And that IO intervention really needs to protect the workers and help organizations understand the impact their decisions have on the individual. So, thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Changing Nature of Work podcast.